The Vienna Gambit begins with white playing e4 and black responding with e5. Instead of the usual move of developing the kingside knight to f3, white plays knight to c3, reserving the opportunity to push the f4 pawn on the next move. This creates a position similar to an improved version of the king's gambit. By playing knight c3, white delays the development of the kingside knight in order to keep the option of pushing f4 open. There are numerous ways for black to misstep in this position. For instance, many players respond with knight f6. Black typically develops one of their knights, either to f6 or c6, as classical chess principles emphasize developing knights before bishops. If black plays knight f6, white can then continue with f4, initiating the gambit. If your opponent is unfamiliar with the theory of the Vienna Gambit, they are highly likely to encounter difficulties very quickly. What is the main issue here? The most commonly played move by black in this position is to capture the pawn on f4, as it mirrors the main idea in the king's gambit, where capturing the pawn with pawn takes f4 is a standard response. However, in the Vienna Gambit, capturing the pawn on f4 is a serious mistake for black. This is because white has already developed their knight to c3, which significantly alters the dynamics of the position. After pawn takes f4, white pushes pawn to e5, creating immediate threats. Suddenly, black's knight on f6 is under attack, and although it may seem like the knight has multiple squares to move to, all of those squares are already controlled by white's pieces, leaving black in a precarious position. In this position, the knight is forced to retreat, and after a few moves, black will often find themselves with most of their pieces still on their original squares. It almost feels like black has conceded the game and is preparing for the next one. Meanwhile, white already has a completely dominant and winning position. However, there is one key point to watch out for in all variations of the Vienna Gambit. After playing pawn to f4, the move slightly weakens the diagonal leading to h4, making it vulnerable to a potential check from the black queen on h4. Although this threat is easy to stop, it is important not to overlook it. The simplest way to prevent this check is to play knight to f3 first. On the next move, regardless of what black does, you can safely play pawn to d4. For example, if black plays pawn to d6, you proceed with pawn to d4, regaining the pawn on f4. At this point, white has a massive lead in development, control of the center, and black's pieces remain completely passive, leaving white with a winning position. There is also a small tactical trick to be aware of in this position. If black plays a typical move, white can simply capture on f4 and maintain the advantage. But if black captures the pawn on e5, a new tactical opportunity arises. In this scenario, theoretically, white could recapture the pawn on e5, for example, with pawn takes e5. However, this would allow an exchange of queens. While this is still an acceptable position for white, ideally, white should aim to keep the queens on the board to maintain attacking chances. To avoid the exchange of queens, white can play queen to e2. This move temporarily sacrifices the pawn on e5, but since the pawn is pinned, black cannot effectively defend it, and white will regain it shortly. By playing queen to e2, white avoids the exchange and keeps the initiative. After queen to e2, black might respond with a move like knight to c6 or something similar. White can then capture the pawn on f4, exploiting the pin on black's pawn. On the following move, white will reclaim the e5 pawn. If black tries to neutralize the pin with a move like bishop to e7, white can proceed with pawn takes e5. At this point, black is in serious trouble. The pawn on e5 disrupts black's ability to develop their pieces normally. Additionally, on the next move, white can play rook to d1, putting pressure on black's queen and further complicating black's position. White has a significant lead in development, strong control over the central squares, and a winning position overall. Let's revisit one of the main positions of this opening. We already know that black capturing the pawn on f4 is a poor decision because it allows white to push pawn to e5, forcing the knight back and gaining a dominant position. But what else can black do? Black might attempt to defend the pawn on e5 with moves like pawn to d6 or knight to c6. Interestingly, both of these moves are problematic for black, and knight to c6 is a particularly common way for black to lose the game outright. After knight to c6, white can respond by capturing the pawn on e5. If black recaptures with the knight, white follows up with pawn to d4, putting immediate pressure on black. The sequence is similar to the earlier variation. When the knight retreats, regardless of where it moves, white continues by pushing pawn to e5, forcing the knight to retreat further. This leads to a position remarkably similar to the previous lines. After a few moves, white develops their pieces, controls the center, and opens several key diagonals for their bishops and queen. Meanwhile, black's position is completely passive, with their pieces remaining inactive and unable to coordinate effectively. Here's another example of how you can overwhelm your opponent quickly in this variation. Let me walk you through a game that showcases how powerful your attack can become in the Vienna Gambit. After pawn to d5, white played bishop to d3. Black responded with knight to e7, as the knight couldn't develop normally to f6 due to the pawn on e5. White then castled, and black played bishop to f5, likely aiming to trade pieces and relieve some pressure. White responded with knight to g5, taking advantage of the position. One of the key strengths of the Vienna Gambit is the semi-open f-file for white's rook, which immediately targets f7. The weakest pawn in black's position and one that is critical to the safety of black's king. At this point, after the exchange of pieces, black has no way to defend f7. And their position collapses. The attack on f7 is decisive, and black is completely lost. At this stage, it's essentially time for black to resign. As there is no defense against white's overwhelming attack, one way for black to respond to white's attack on the central pawn is by defending it with pawn to d6. At first glance, this seems like a standard move to solidify the pawn on e5, but it's a passive choice that locks black's dark-squared bishop behind their pawn structure. This move is far from being a refutation of the Vienna Gambit. After pawn to d6, white can simply continue with knight to f3, adding more pressure to the e5 pawn. If black defends at knight to c6, white can play bishop to b5, creating a position reminiscent of the Ruy Lopez, but with the added benefit of the f4 pawn. This pawn makes white's position more dynamic and provides greater influence over the center. The pin created by bishop to b5, white renews the threat to the e5 pawn. If black responds with bishop to d7, white can play pawn to d3, reinforcing their center. A common mistake for black in this position is blundering the e5 pawn on the next move. For example, black might play bishop to e7 or pawn to a6, which amusingly invites white to win the pawn outright. Even if black avoids this blunder, white's position remains far superior. After castling, white enjoys an active setup with strong central pawns, an open f-file for the rook, and significant space advantage on the kingside. This gives white excellent attacking prospects in the middle game. In most cases, black plays bishop to e7, but this move is a blunder that simply loses the e5 pawn. White can eliminate the defender by exchanging on c6, and then capture the e5 pawn. Bishop takes c6, pawn takes e5, and knight takes e5. Now, white is attacking the bishop on e6, and black has no effective way to counter. It's important to note that white must first play pawn to d3 before executing this sequence. This ensures that the e4 pawn is defended, preventing black from capturing it and avoiding any counterplay. After setting up with pawn to d3, white proceeds with the exchange on c6, wins the e5 pawn, and gains a decisive advantage. Black's attempt to play conservatively with bishop to e6 backfires, and they end up losing very quickly. I hope you understand all these variations. If you found this video helpful, then subscribe, and thanks for watching.